Good morning, Noreena, and thank you very much for giving some of your time to come and talk to the Mint magazine.
I'm delighted that you've invited me on.
Well, I was really struck by seeing that your focus on loneliness, because I saw you were economist interested in loneliness, and I thought I've never, I've never come across an economist that had a research interest in loneliness. So I'm really interested to learn how you move, because I can see in the past you've looked at the political economy, debt, sort of behavioral decision making, and so forth, and now you've got to loneliness. So I was really interested to learn about your sort of journey and how you took an interest in this area.
Well, that is a great question because you're absolutely right. This isn't the normal territory that economists unpack, but it was really three reasons that made me want to dig into this whole issue to the extent that I did. The first was my students. So I'd been teaching at university for around 20 years, and what I started observing probably about 4 years ago was increasing numbers of my students were coming into my office and in office hours confiding in me that they were feeling lonely and isolated. And this wasn't something I'd seen historically, at least not at the scale I was seeing it. And I'd up until then probably thought of loneliness primarily as being something that affected elderly people. But the fact so many of my students were coming to me sharing that they were experiencing it felt new and worth further investigation. And then in my academic research, I am an economist, but I've always been very interested in the intersection between economics and politics and psychology. In my academic research, I was looking at the rise of right-wing populism across the globe, and I really wanted to understand the drivers for this. And as I started interviewing and hearing the testimonies of right-wing populist voters in the United States, in France, in Italy, and Germany, and also looking at the academic literature, it became clear to me that loneliness was a shared concern and a shared plight of many of the people who've been turning in recent years to right-wing populist parties. Lonely in the sense of not having friends or a support system. If you look at Donald Trump voters, for example, they have significantly less friends and less acquaintances, and say they have less people they can rely upon than Democrat voters, but also lonely in the sense of feeling invisible, unseen, unheard, left behind, marginalized. So lonely in that sense as well. Yeah. So a very, very different arena where I was seeing loneliness as a theme. And the third reason that I started really looking into loneliness, because all of these things were happening at roughly the same time, was I had bought an Alexa, an Amazon virtual assistant. I started observing how I was interacting with my Alexa and how I was feeling towards her. And I realized that I was feeling increasingly attached to this little device that sat in my kitchen, which got me thinking about what I came to define as the loneliness economy. An entire market for goods and services designed essentially to deliver connection and alleviate loneliness, that even before the pandemic was rising. And of course, during the pandemic has really accelerated in its size and scale. So it was those three very different insights happening at roughly the same time that made me think I really want to dig into this subject. And as I did, the first thing that I realized was firstly the scale of the problem. 1 in 5 millennials feeling lonely always or often. 4 in 5 18 to 24-year-olds feeling lonely often or sometimes. 60% of pensioners in old people's homes having no visitors at all. So when I realized the scale which has again significantly increased during the pandemic, I thought I really want to investigate this. And especially as an economist, I wasn't only struck by the fact that loneliness is bad for our health, and it is bad for our health, physical and mental, but also, and it also threatens our democracy, I argue, but also because of its economic impact, because we know that because loneliness is so bad for our health, slashing our life expectancy, increasing our risk of heart disease, stroke, as well as responsible for a whole host of mental anguish. It's imposing a very significant cost on our healthcare budgets, but also creating a cost on the economy, because lonely workers are less productive, less efficient, more likely to quit a company than workers who aren't. So loneliness is bad for business too. So lots of reasons to be thinking about this subject, to be concerned about it, and to want to understand what's driving it, and want to figure out what to do about it as well. And my book covers all these aspects.
Brilliant. So when actually did you start your research? Because presumably before the pandemic, was it?
Yes. So, some of these themes that I develop in the book around the need to kind of reclaim capitalism, and so that it comes closer to its earlier configurations and go back to a more relational form of capitalism where we value the relationship and not only the transaction. Some of those kind of themes I've been developing for about a decade now, but the really intense research into loneliness more specifically began about 4 years ago. And I was just finishing the book when the pandemic struck. And and I actually I was meant to deliver it. And I said to my publishers in March of last year, I said, look, I need to see how this is unfolding. I'm going to wait a few months. And I waited through the summer and saw what was happening and realized that actually I could weave the unfolding COVID story through the book, because everything that I'd seen, that I'd identified, that I'd kind of realized through writing the book and through my research was only accelerating thanks to the pandemic. And that's what I did. And I kind of wove the unfolding COVID story into the book and submitted it in the late last summer, and then revised the book again in January. So the paperback's coming out in June, and that is very up to date.
And did you go back and interview or update the people you previously interviewed before the pandemic to find out how they'd been affected, or weren't you able to do that?
I didn't do that because, I wove in other people's kind of stories of during the pandemic rather than going back to stories. But the book is full of stories. I think that's a great observation. The book is not only full of academic research and hundreds of pages of footnotes, but full of stories, like journalistic stories. When I, for example, experienced the loneliness economy myself in various forms, not only through my Alexa, I even rented a friend in New York.
Right.
Yeah, because the market, has been very innovative in terms of coming up with solutions to loneliness. And one thing it's created is a whole market for friends that you can rent by the hour. And in New York, I rented Brittany, a 24-year-old woman. I was a bit worried. Was this something untoward? But it really wasn't. I met her in a cafe. We went to a bookstore. We went to a clothes store. We tried on hats and sunglasses together. Obviously, it wasn't like being with an old friend, but it was, when you meet someone new and you're kind of riffing with them and it feels fun. Well, that's what it felt like, until we're standing in Urban Outfitters, the clothes store, and she turns around to me and she says, "That'll be $120, please." Because my time was up. I asked Brittany who hires her, and she told me that it was typically professionals, women as well as men, people aged between 30 and 40 typically, who worked in finance, technology, and consulting, who'd moved to Manhattan, didn't have support systems there, were working very long hours, didn't have time to make friends, and wanted someone to go for a coffee with, or go for a walk with, or go to the park with, and so rented somebody. And actually, the website where I found Brittany has over 600,000 friends to rent on it now.
Wow, that is extraordinary. I really like the way that you value putting in stories, because that is also not what economists do generally, isn't it? That a story or a case study is not really valid because it's got to be all data or nothing, isn't it?
Yes, but that's something that I've challenged actually kind of throughout my academic career. And I remember doing economics as an undergraduate and finding it rather unsatisfying as a discipline, because at that level, it really was taught pretty much in the form of graphs and mathematics. And I always thought, can you reduce a world that is this complex and this multifaceted to numbers? And it was something that bothered me. And it was only when I really went and did my PhD at Cambridge in economics, that I realized that actually there were all these other branches of economics that I hadn't really been aware of hitherto. Institutional economics, that looked at the role of institutions and culture and history. Evolutionary economics, that looked at the role of biology, and that actually there were all these other fascinating aspects of economics that I hadn't been aware of. And one of the things that I've always committed to for my own research, and I did it with my PhD, and I've done it throughout my career, is I really do my thinking from the bottom up. And so whether it was my PhD, which looked at economic transition in Russia in the early 90s, asking the question, can you design a market economy from above? Where I really started my research in factories across Russia, looking at what was changing bottom up to start answering this much bigger question of, can you design a market economy? To my research for The Lonely Century, where I thought it was very important to actually interview, meet, and experience aspects of loneliness and the loneliness economy in order to help figure out where things were heading. Because numbers definitely give us a lot of information, but we've got to be careful not to suffer from number myopia, whereby we believe that only things that can be measured matter, because that really isn't the case if you're interested in figuring out what's going on and doing something about it.
Yeah. And of course, actually, what figures are available is a matter of the political economy and who chooses to collect what data and so on. Anyway, I'm interested that you did sort of get a wider sense of economics at Cambridge, because actually Cambridge is not well known for pluralism in its economics at all, is it?
Yeah, I think I was very lucky in that I actually had 3 supervisors, 2 from economics and 1 who was a sociologist, and it was a really good combination. I think I was also lucky because I was looking at something quite specific, like Russia, which was moving obviously at that point from communism to a quasi-market economy. So it would have been ridiculous to try and make sense of that without looking at history, institutions, culture, and all these other factors. So yes, I was really lucky. And I guess the kind of economists that have inspired me of the past have been people maybe who come from the broader political economy kind of rubric. So if we're talking about someone like Adam Smith, who obviously was an economist, but also of course was very concerned about ethics, about institutions as well. And also I'm also of course inspired by, not that I always agree with, thinkers who have looked at economics and not necessarily been economists themselves. So like Marx, of course, who actually did write about alienation, which is one way of thinking about loneliness for sure. Or sociologists like Durkheim,
yes.
Who wrote about anomie, the state of feeling disconnected from the world. So I'm interested in thinkers who, maybe not traditional economists, but who've also been interested in economics and had something to say about economics more broadly as well. Max Weber as well, of course. Yeah.
Well, that's certainly in line with, yes, our approach in the magazine and more broadly. So obviously a key theme is the impact of the digital economy on connection or lack of connection. And now, post-pandemic, everyone is, well, not quite post-pandemic, but people are talking about the sort of patterns that we've seen emerge of home working, of much more interaction via, Zoom and so on, and is going to become more major. What did you find about how the increasing dominance of the digital economy had affected loneliness or connectivity, and what do you think this means for the future now this whole process has been accelerated?
So I think two things to say on digital. One is around social media. Now, I began my research very agnostic about the role that social media did or didn't play in today's loneliness crisis, and having really dug into the academic literature as well as conducted numerous interviews, especially with teenagers on this subject, I've come away feeling very strongly that it is playing a really significant role. I mean, we kind of had a sense that this might be going on, because what we saw was a real rise and kind of in loneliness amongst young people from about 2010 onwards, pretty much in lockstep with smartphone usage and social media usage in particular amongst this age group. But of course, that could have been correlation, not causation. It was hard to know definitively until about 2019, that is, when there was a very landmark seminal study conducted at Stanford University where 1,500 students were charged with using Facebook as usual, and the other 1,500, so they had a control group, and the other 1,500 were told to delete Facebook for 2 months. Then they compared how the two different groups felt, behaved, etc. The results were unambiguous. The group that deleted Facebook, interestingly, didn't just go and spend time on other platforms, so replace that time, substitute Facebook with other online interactions. No, they spent considerably more time doing things in person with friends and family. But also, very interestingly and importantly, the group that deleted Facebook was significantly less lonely and significantly than the other group. And similar studies have now been replicated using other social media platforms and found very similar results. So we know, definitively now that staying off social media makes you feel less lonely. And I think there's a number of reasons why this might be so, especially, having interviewed many young people around this. I think firstly, when you're on social media, it's easy to just believe that everyone is more popular than you. It just looks like everyone's got more friends, more followers, more likes, having, better time with their friends.
Yes.
That's really easy to feel. The other reason is, of course, that we know that these platforms are designed to addict us and to keep us addicted. And so designed like slot machines in casinos, really. And so what they're doing is they take us away from face-to-face interactions, which are significantly deeper and more rewarding and replenishing than digital ones. Digital interactions are almost like fast food, the fast food equivalent of communication. You eat them, you gorge on them, they feel good for a moment, and then you realize that actually they're not good for you. And we also know that, unfortunately, with young people especially, social media is a vector of abuse and hate, with 65% of UK students having experienced cyberbullying, and 1 in 3 women in the UK aged between 18 to 24 having experienced abuse on Facebook. So, and of course, if you're experiencing abuse, or even if you're witnessing abuse, the world is going to feel a lonelier world. So social media really part of the problem. But the other important aspect of digital that I think we should think about if we're thinking about loneliness is the rise of a phenomenon that I talk about in my book, contactless living. So by which I mean, ordering your books on Amazon rather than going to your local bookstore, ordering your food on Deliveroo rather than going to a local cafe, ordering online groceries rather than going to the supermarket, doing your yoga on YouTube with Adrienne rather than going to your local yoga studio. This was already a trend before the pandemic, but what we saw, of course, during the pandemic is, because we had no choice, and we were in fact grateful that there was a way we could still do things, there was a massive migration and acceleration of a massive migration online and a massive acceleration of contactless living. Why this matters, why we really need to commit to a summer to reconnect in person, is because firstly, we know that face-to-face interactions are less rewarding and deliver lower levels of connection. Even a 30-second face-to-face exchange in a cafe with a barista has been shown to massively increase how connected people feel and how happy they feel. The second reason why this matters, this move to contactless living, is that actually our brick and mortar local stores and cafes play very significant roles in nurturing our communities and feeding our communities. So we need them actually as much as they need us. The third reason why this move to contactless really matters is because if you don't use it, you lose it. And, this may sound extreme, but one of the things I observed with my students, and it was another reason why I got interested in the subject, was compared to previous years, I noticed that increasing numbers of students were finding it hard to effectively interact face-to-face in a room.
Yeah.
Because they were spending so much time on their screens, they were finding it hard to do. And I raised this with a colleague who runs one of America's most prestigious Ivy League universities. And he said to me, we're seeing exactly the same thing here. In fact, here it's so bad, we're running remedial how to read a face in real life classes for our students. Literally, if you're in a room and somebody's kind of got their arms folded, that's a bad sign. Or if they're frowning, that means it's not going well. So really having to teach those cues. So if we don't use it, we lose it, which is why we need to recommit to connecting. And the fourth reason is because contactless living is bad, I argue, for democracy itself. This is because it's really only through face-to-face interactions that we really can practice the skills that underpin inclusive democracy: reciprocity, civility, thinking about others' needs, not only ourselves. So, it's when we're wheeling our trolley around a supermarket and we see an elderly lady trying to reach for a jam jar and we go and help them. That's the moment when we're thinking about others' needs. Or if we're in a yoga class and we're putting down our mat and thinking quite consciously, to be mindful not to downward dog in someone else's face, that's the moment when we're thinking about others and not only ourselves. So practicing these skills. So my fear is that if we move increasingly to contactless living, we won't have the opportunity to practice these skills, which is why it matters.
And I mean, all that makes incredible sense. And I can see there's a lot of things that as individuals, I'm just thinking I'm going to delete Facebook from my iPhone at very least and iPad, and also obviously commit to trying to go to local markets and all those sorts of things. But one of the things I just picked up from what you said is you talked about how these digital interfaces are designed like slot machines to addict. And also you talked about the economy of loneliness. So obviously there seems to be something we can try and do to fight it. But what are the drivers, the economic drivers that are going on in terms of the people who are designing these interfaces? And is there any move for them to be responsible? Is there any move to try and sort of control or engage or get change in that area?
So, I do see social media companies in many ways as the tobacco companies of the 21st century, and as such do believe that they should be regulated as such, especially when it comes to children. In the United Kingdom, we do actually have legislation that was announced in the Queen's speech, so upcoming legislation which will regulate social media companies significantly more. We still
do
have
what? In what way? What do they have to do?
There'll be much more of a duty of care when it comes to ensuring that users are not physically or psychologically harmed. It will fines, significantly greater fines on social media companies that transgress. But we still have to see, the legislation's been announced, but we haven't seen exactly what's going to be in it yet. So it's definitely a step in the right direction for sure. And other governments are thinking about this. In fact, it's one of those rare issues in the United States where there's bipartisan agreement now that regulating social media companies needs to be on the agenda. So I think we will see more regulation coming. It's why the social media companies are really now, doing all they can to present whiter than white images of themselves and actually call for regulation themselves, but obviously in a much more watered down form than society would ideally need. But this isn't only about social media when it comes to structural drivers. When we're talking about economic and structural drivers, I think another reason why this is the lonely century has to do with the particular type of capitalism that has ruled the roost over the past few decades, neoliberalism, for two reasons. First, we're all aware now of the income asymmetries that neoliberalism has wielded in terms of growing income and wealth gaps. And even though everyone can be lonely, whether you're rich or poor, what we do know is that if you are on a low income, or if you're unemployed, or if you've lost your job or lost a decent job or the opportunity to have a decent job, you are more likely to feel lonely. So we know that there's an economic ramification in that sense, and that helps account in part for that sense of marginalization and invisibility that some people who've turned to populist politicians clearly feel, but also neoliberalism playing a role because it's shaped a very particular mindset, one in which we've increasingly as a society come to see ourselves as competitors rather than collaborators, as takers rather than givers, as hustlers rather than helpers, a me first, I focused mindset, which inevitably was going to beget a lonelier world. So that's, another kind of structural driver. And just because I know that your audience is interested in structural drivers too, one more just to briefly speak to, which is we need a physical infrastructure of community, by which I mean public libraries, public parks, community centres, youth clubs, daycare centres, elderly daycare centres. We need there to be physical spaces where people come together and are able to come together and interact. Yet what we've seen since the 2008 financial crisis across the globe, and in the UK included, has been a really steady defunding of what we might think of as this infrastructure of community. In the United Kingdom, 130 public libraries were closed down in 2019 alone. That's something which needs to be redressed as a matter of urgency. So lots that governments can do. My book's full of that. Lots that businesses can do, actually also in terms of innovation, because I do think the market has a role to play in delivering community and connection. I'm not anti that at all. In South Korea, there's a lovely example of this where there are daytime discos for elderly people, private ventures. Thousands of elderly people dance at these discos during the daytime. Love this idea. So these are businesses stepping in to address loneliness, and technology, robots, social robots, I think have a role to play here too. But also, as we said, much that we can do as individuals. Yes, we can try and use our phones less, fight that addiction. It is hard, but it is possible. I try and spend one day a week digital free, take a digital Sabbath. We can nurture our own local communities more, shop at our local shops, shop at our local studios, fight that pull that we now have to choose convenience over connection that contactless living provides. And we can also think, is there anyone in our own network who might be feeling lonely right now? And if there is, consciously reach out to them. Pick up the phone, arrange to meet them in a socially distanced, safe way, even just send them a text. Just showing someone that you're thinking about them, that they're visible to you, can make a huge difference to how they feel.
Well, thank you very much. I think that's a very good point to end on, with a positive action people can take. But obviously, there's going to be a lot more discussion and debate about how to change something that has obviously gone deeply in the wrong direction over the last few decades. And I'm sure you'll be a major player in that debate. So I look forward to what you talk about next. And thank you very much for being part of this interview.
Thank you so much.